The Grand Chamber of the Galactic Council had never been this quiet. Before Ambassador Zix Thurl stood at the center of the massive room, and his forearms trembled as he pressed the button to play the transmission again for the 100th time that day. On the holographic display above him, 3,000 human warships moved through space in perfect formation, and every single one of them was heading toward Earth. "This cannot be real," whispered High Counselor Morthax from his elevated seat, and his crystalline body flickered with confused light patterns. But it was real, and every species representative in that chamber knew it deep in their hearts. 37 different alien races sat in the Grand Chamber that day, and not one of them could understand what they were seeing on that screen. The humans were attacking their own homeworld. Ambassador Kelveth of the Rithian Collective rose from her seat, and her blue tentacles wrapped around each other in a gesture of extreme distress. "Have they gone completely insane?" she asked, and her voice echoed through the silent chamber. No one answered her, because no one had an answer to give. Every species in the galaxy had one rule that was never broken, and that rule was simply protect your homeworld above everything else. The Velnorians had once sacrificed 3 colony worlds to save their home planet from an asteroid. The Gorveth had surrendered half their empire in a war just to keep enemies away from their cradle world. The Deshans had developed technology specifically designed to hide their homeworld from any threat. But the humans? The humans were sending their own warships to attack Earth with weapons that could crack continents and boil oceans. High Counselor Morthax raised one of his crystal arms, and the chamber fell even more silent, if that was possible. "Show us the latest images from our observation probes," he commanded. Zixral nodded and changed the display with shaking hands. What appeared on the screen made several ambassadors cry out in horror. Human dreadnoughts hung in orbit around Earth, and they were firing down at the planet's surface with plasma cannons and nuclear missiles. Massive explosions bloomed across the continents, and cities that had stood for thousands of years vanished in bright flashes of destruction. Drop pods fell from the warships like rain, and each one carried human soldiers armed for war. "They are killing their own people," said Ambassador Threlanax of the Vortian Empire, and his insectoid face showed an emotion that might have been nausea. "They are destroying their own cities," added another voice from somewhere in the chamber. "They are burning their own world." The chaos of voices grew louder and louder until Morthax had to use his authority tone to silence everyone. "We must find an explanation for this madness," he declared, and his crystal body pulsed with commanding light. Ambassador Prelax Var stood up slowly, and everyone turned to look at him. Prelax was a Deshan diplomat who had spent 40 years living among humans and studying their strange ways, and he was considered the greatest expert on human behavior in the entire council. His bioluminescent skin glowed with troubled amber colors as he stepped forward to address the assembly. "I have a theory," he said, and his voice was heavy with worry. "Then speak it." Morthax Commandant Prelax took a deep breath and organized his thoughts carefully. "I have lived with humans for 4 decades, and I have seen them do many things that seem crazy to us, but always made sense to them in the end." He paused and looked around the chamber at all the confused and frightened faces. "Humans do not attack without reason, and they especially would never attack Earth without a very, very good reason." "What reason could possibly justify this?" demanded Kelveth. "I do not know yet," Prelax admitted, and his skin flickered with frustrated orange. "But I believe we are not seeing an attack. I believe we are seeing a liberation." Laughter erupted from several parts of the chamber, and the sound was harsh and mocking. "Liberation? From what?" asked High Counselor Morthax, and even his ancient voice carried a tone of disbelief. "From themselves?" added Ambassador Threlanax with a clicking sound that indicated Sarkis. Prelax did not answer right away because he himself was not sure of the answer. Instead, he requested access to all communications from Earth over the past 6 months, and what he found made his blood run cold. 6 months ago, Earth had been normal with billions of messages flowing out to the colonies every day. Then, 5 months ago, the messages started to change in small ways that most observers would miss. The words were the same, but something was different about them. 4 months ago, the changes became more obvious and the messages started to feel wrong somehow. 3 months ago, several human colonies reported that visitors from Earth were acting strangely. 2 months ago, all communication from Earth stopped completely and the planet went silent. 1 month ago, the human fleet began to gather, and Admiral Marcus Chun took command of every ship outside the Sol system. And now the fleet was attacking Earth with everything they had. Prelax turned back to the council with fear in his heart. Something happened on Earth, he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. Something terrible happened, and the humans outside the Sol system are trying to stop it. Stop what? Morthax demanded. Before Prelax could answer, another aide rushed into the chamber carrying a data crystal. High Counselor, the aide shouted, and protocol was forgotten in his panic. We found one last transmission from Earth before the silence. You need to see this immediately. The crystal was inserted into the display system, and a video began to play. It showed a street in one of Earth's great cities, and everything looked normal at first, with humans walking and talking and living their lives. Then, a woman in the video turned toward the camera, and her face changed. Her smile stretched too wide until it reached her ears, and her eyes multiplied across her forehead, and her body flickered like it existed in 2 places at once. The video lasted only 3 seconds before it cut to static. The grand chamber erupted into screams and shouts of terror. Several ambassadors fled their seats, and others called for emergency protocols. High Counselor Morthax sat frozen in his seat, and his crystal body had turned completely dark with shock. Only Prelax Vior remained calm, because now he understood. Humans are not insane, he said, and his voice cut through the chaos like a knife. They are doing what humans have always done when something threatens their home. He pointed at the display still showing the burning Earth. They are fighting to take it back, even if they have to destroy it first. The council had no words left to say. They could only watch as humanity waged war against their own cradle world and pray that the humans knew what they were doing. Because if the humans failed, then whatever had taken Earth might come for the rest of the galaxy next, and that thought terrified the council more than anything they had ever faced before. 6 months before the attack, the research vessel Prometheus Rising floated above the deepest part of the Pacific Ocean. Dr. Elena Vasquez stood at the observation window and stared down into the darkness below with wonder in her eyes. Are you sure about these readings? She asked her assistant without looking away from the water. Yes, doctor, replied young Thomas Chun, and his voice was full of excitement. The scanner shows a massive structure at the bottom, something that should not exist at that depth. Elena nodded slowly, and a smile spread across her face. She had spent 20 years searching for something like this, and now she had finally found it. Prepare the deep dive vessel, she ordered, and her team jumped into action immediately. 3 hours later, Elena and 4 other scientists descended into the crushing darkness of the ocean floor. Their vessel was designed to handle extreme pressure, but even so the metal groaned and complained as they went deeper and deeper. Then the lights of their vessel revealed something that made everyone gasp. A door. Not a natural formation, and not something humans had built, but an actual door made of a material that seemed to absorb light itself. It was massive and ancient and covered in symbols that hurt the eyes if you looked at them too long. This is impossible, whispered Dr. James Morrison, who was an expert in ancient history. This door is at least 60 million years old. That is before humans even existed. Elena moved closer to the door and felt something strange in her mind. Like a whisper she could not quite hear. We need to open it, she said, and her voice sounded different somehow. We need to see what is inside." The other scientists looked at each other with worried expressions, but none of them could bring themselves to disagree. Something about this place made them want to obey. They spent 2 weeks studying the door and trying to find a way to open it. Finally, they discovered that the symbols were a kind of lock, and if you touched them in the right order, the door would respond. Elena pressed the final symbol and the door began to open for the first time in 60 million years. At first there was only darkness inside. Then something moved in that darkness, and it moved toward the light. What came out of that door had no name that human mouths could speak, and no form that human eyes could truly see. It existed between dimensions and slipped through reality like water through fingers. It had been imprisoned in that dark place for longer than mammals had walked the earth, and it was very, very hungry. The entity touched Elena's mind first, and she welcomed it like an old friend because it made her feel that way within seconds. It learned everything about humanity from her thoughts, their history and their technology and their weaknesses and their billions of delicious minds waiting to be consumed. The other scientists were taken next, and they smiled as the entity filled them up and pushed their original selves into tiny, dark corners of their own heads. The Prometheus Rising returned to the surface and docked at the nearest port city. No one noticed anything wrong because the possessed scientists looked and acted perfectly normal. They smiled and laughed and talked about their exciting discovery, and with every handshake and every conversation, the entity spread a little further. It called itself many things in many languages, but the closest translation was simply the hunger. The hunger spread through humanity like a disease that no one could detect. First it took the port city, one person at a time, until everyone was smiling that same slightly wrong smile. Then it spread to the nearby cities through travelers and phone calls and video messages. Within a month, it had reached every continent. Within 2 months, it had taken most of Earth's population. The possessed humans continued their normal lives because that was the best way to avoid suspicion. They went to work and raised their children and watched entertainment and did everything normal humans did, but behind their eyes was something ancient and cold that was slowly digesting their souls. Admiral Marcus Chun was commanding the outer colony fleet when he first noticed something strange. His wife on Earth had stopped using the little jokes they always shared in their messages. His daughter's communications felt hollow and empty. Somehow his old friends from the academy were all saying the same things in the same way. Then, one day, all communication from Earth just stopped. Luna Base went silent at the same hour Mars colony stopped responding to calls. The inner solar system had gone completely quiet. Admiral Chun sent 3 scout ships to investigate and told them to be very careful. 2 of those ships never came back. The 3rd ship returned after a week, and Chun went personally to greet the crew. When the airlock opened, the 5 crew members walked out in perfect unison. They moved at exactly the same pace and turned their heads at exactly the same angle, and when they saw Admiral Chun, they all smiled at the same time, with smiles that were just a little too wide. "Admiral Chun," they said together in one voice that came from 5 mouths. "We have wonderful news from Earth. Everything is fine, and you should come home." Chun felt ice form in his stomach as he looked into their eyes and saw nothing human looking back. "Security!" he shouted, and his guards raised their weapons immediately. The possessed crew members tilted their heads to the side, all at the same angle, and their smiles grew wider. "There is no need for weapons, Admiral. We just want you to come home and join us." Chun drew his own pistol and fired without hesitation. The fight was short and brutal, and when it was over, Chun stood over 5 bodies that had once been his friends. Knew then that Earth was lost not to invasion and not to war, but to something far worse than any enemy he had ever faced. He gathered his senior officers and told them the terrible truth. "Earth has been taken," he said, and his voice was hard as steel. "Everyone we knew and everyone we loved is gone, replaced by something else wearing their faces. The officers stared at him in horror, and some of them had tears running down their cheeks. "What do we do?" "Sir?" asked Captain Sarah Williamson, looked out the window at the stars, and made his decision. "We gather every human ship outside the Sol system, military and civilian and mining vessels, everything that can fly and fight." He turned back, too. Face his officers with fire in his eyes. "And then we go home, and we take our planet back from whatever stole it." "But sir," said Commander Rodriguez with a trembling voice, "that means we will have to fight against billions of our own people." Chen nodded slowly, and the pain in his heart was deeper than any wound. "I know," he said, "but those are not our people anymore. Our people are already dead." He slammed his fist on the table with enough force to crack the surface. "We are going to avenge them and free our world, even if we have to burn it clean." The humans of the outer colonies began to gather their fleet. 3,200 ships answered the count. Every single one of them knew they were going to war against their own home. It was madness by any reasonable measure, but humans had never been reasonable when it came to protecting what was theirs. The emergency session of the Galactic Council lasted for 3 days straight, and no one was allowed to leave until a decision was reached. 17 different species offered to send diplomats to negotiate peace between the human fleet and whatever remained on Earth. 8 species offered to take human refugees and give them new worlds to live on far away from their burning homeworld. 3 species demanded that the Council send military forces to stop what they called the greatest act of self-destruction in galactic history, and 47 species argued about all of these options until their voices grew hoarse and their translators began to malfunction from overuse. High Counselor Morthax watched the chaos from his elevated seat, and his crystal body pulsed with frustrated light. "Order!" he commanded in his authority voice, and the chamber fell silent once again. "We cannot make a decision while shouting at each other like primitive creatures." Ambassador Kelveth rose from her seat, and her blue tentacles gestured toward the main display. It still showed images of Earth under attack. "High Counselor, we must do something immediately. The humans are destroying their own civilization as we watch." "And what would you have us do?" asked Ambassador Threlanax with a clicking sound of annoyance. "Send our ships to fight against 3,000 human warships? That would be suicide for whoever we send. Then, we must at least try to communicate with them and understand why they are doing this madness." "We have tried," shouted another ambassador from across the chamber. "Every message we send is ignored, and every probe we send is destroyed before it gets close." The arguing began again, and Morthax let it continue for a few minutes before raising his arm for silence once more. "Ambassador Prelax Var," he said, and all eyes turned to the Deshan diplomat who had been sitting quietly throughout the entire debate. "You have lived among humans longer than anyone in this chamber. What do you believe we should do?" Prelax stood slowly, and his bioluminescent skin shifted to several colors before settling on a deep, thoughtful blue. "I believe we should do nothing," he said. The chamber erupted into shocked protests, and several ambassadors accused Prelax of being heartless or cowardly or both. Prelax waited for the noise to die down before he continued speaking. "I do not mean we should not care," he explained, and his voice was calm despite the hostile atmosphere. "I mean, we should not interfere because we do not understand what is really happening." He walked to the center of the chamber and activated a personal display device. "I have spent the last 3 days studying every piece of data we have about Earth and the human fleet." Images appeared in the air around him, showing the timeline of events over the past 6 months. 6 months ago, Earth was normal with billions of messages flowing to the colonies every day. He pointed to a section of the timeline where the data suddenly changed. Then something happened, and the communications began to change in subtle ways. Another section lit up showing scattered reports from human colonies. Visitors from Earth were reported acting strangely, speaking in unison and moving in coordinated patterns and smiling in ways that made other humans uncomfortable. The final section of the timeline glowed red. Then Earth went silent and Admiral Chun gathered his fleet for what we are now witnessing. Prelax turned to face the council directly. Does this look like madness to you? Does this look like a species that has lost its mind? He shook his head, and his skin flickered with passionate orange. This looks like a species that discovered a threat so terrible that they chose to destroy their own world rather than let it spread. Ambassador Kelveth rose again with confusion on her face. But what threat could possibly be worth such destruction? Prelax pointed to the frozen image from the video they had seen earlier, the woman with the too wide smile and the multiplying eyes. That, he said simply, something took Earth and replaced its people with copies, and the humans outside the Sol system realized it before anyone else did. The chamber fell into a heavy silence as the implications sank in High Counselor Morthax leaned forward in his seat. You are saying that the entity in that video has possessed the entire population of Earth? I am saying it is possible, Prelax replied, and I am saying the humans believe it is true, which is why they are willing to burn their own world to stop it. Ambassador Threlanax made a sound of disbelief. No species would destroy their homeworld based on a suspicion. Prelax laughed, and the sound was tired and amazed at the same time. You still do not understand humans at all, he said. Let me tell you something I learned during my 40 years living among them. He began to pace back and forth as he spoke. Humans are not like us. They do not calculate costs and benefits the way we do. When a human family is threatened, the human does not think about survival or logic or reasonable responses. They think about one thing and one thing only: protecting what they love. He stopped pacing and looked around at the alien faces watching him. I once saw a human mother lift a ground vehicle off her trapped child with her bare hands, something that should have been physically impossible. I once saw a human soldier charge an enemy position, alone because his friends were pinned down behind him. I once saw a human pilot crash her damaged ship into an enemy vessel to save a transport full of civilians. His skin blazed with bright white light as he reached his conclusion. Humans do not surrender what is theirs, ever. Not to enemies, and not to impossible odds, and not even to death itself. He pointed at the display showing the battle for Earth. What you are seeing is not madness. It is love. It is grief and rage and determination, all mixed together into something that we cannot comprehend. Those humans are killing their own people because their own people are already dead, replaced by something wearing their faces, and they would rather burn their world to ashes than let that something win. The council sat in stunned silence as they processed his words. Finally, High Counselor Morthax spoke in a voice that was unusually soft. What do you recommend we do, Ambassador Prelax? Prelax turned off his display and returned to his seat. I recommend we watch and pray that the humans succeed. Because if they fail, then whatever took Earth will not stay there. It will spread to other worlds and other species. And when that happens, we will wish we had humans to fight for us. The council voted to observe and not interfere officially. They called it respect for human sovereignty. But everyone in that chamber knew the real reason they were afraid. Not of the entity on Earth, but of the humans who were willing to sacrifice everything to destroy it, because a species that would burn its own cradle world was a species that nothing in the galaxy could stop. The dust took 3 months to settle, and when it finally did, the survivors could see what remained of their world. Earth was scarred in ways that would take generations to heal. Cities lay in ruins across every continent, and the oceans still steamed. In places where nuclear weapons had boiled the water, the sky was gray with ash, and the sun looked pale and distant through the haze. 4 billion humans had lived on Earth before the entity came. Now less than 2 billion remained, and many of those were traumatized beyond recovery. Admiral Marcus Chun stood in the ashes of what had once been Beijing and stared at the gray sky above with empty eyes. He had won the battle, but he felt no victory in his heart. His son Thomas had died in the Pacific. Assault leading the Marine squad that protected Dr. Vasquez's granddaughter had been among the possessed, and when they freed her, she had no memory of the past 6 months. Only nightmares that woke her screaming every night. His wife had been taken. In the first wave of the entity's spread, and there had been nothing left of her to save Chun, had given the order to fire on the building where she was hiding with 1,000 other possessed humans. He would carry that weight until the day he died. Shuttle descended from orbit and landed nearby with the markings of the Galactic Council on its hull. Ambassador Prelax Vier emerged from the vessel and walked slowly toward Admiral Chun. His bioluminescent skin was dim with sorrow as he approached. "Admiral Chun," Prelax said, and his voice was gentle. "The Galactic Council has sent me to offer our assistance." Chun turned to look at the alien diplomat, and Prelax flinched at what he saw in those human eyes. There was no madness there, and no grief that he could recognize. There was something harder, something that had been forged in fire and loss, and would never break. "What kind of assistance?" Chun asked, and his voice was flat and tired. "Reconstruction materials and medical supplies and colony ships. If your people wish to relocate to safer worlds." Prelax hesitated before continuing. "The Council believes that Earth may be too damaged to support human civilization anymore." Chun laughed, and the sound was harsh and broken. "Too damaged?" He repeated. "Ambassador, I have fought in wars across 12 star systems, and I have seen worlds burned to glass by enemy weapons." He gestured at the ruined city around them. "This is our home. We were born here, and our ancestors are buried here, and our children will grow up here. We are not leaving." Prelax nodded slowly because he had expected this answer. "Then we will provide whatever aid you need to rebuild." He paused, and his skin flickered with curious blue light. "The Council also wishes to understand how you did it." "Did what?" "How you found the strength to destroy your own world in order to save it." Chun was quiet for a long moment, and his eyes moved across the devastation before them. Human survivors were already working in the ruins, clearing rubble and setting up shelters and organizing supply lines. Even now, with everything destroyed, they refused to stop moving forward. "You want to know our secret?" Chun finally said. He smiled, and it was a tired, broken, undefeated smile that Prelax would remember for the rest of his long life. "We are not sane, Ambassador. We never have been. We are just too stubborn to let anything else decide when we die or how we live." He turned and began walking toward the nearest group of workers. "Tell your council that humanity thanks them for the offer of aid. But tell them also that we will rebuild Earth ourselves if we have to. We always do." Prelax watched him go, and then returned to his shuttle with a heavy heart. He spent the journey back to Council space composing his report. When he finally presented it to the assembled representatives, his words changed the way the galaxy thought about humans forever. "The humans have retaken Earth," he announced to the silent chamber. "They have paid a terrible price. Billions dead, and their homeworld scarred perhaps beyond full recovery. But they have won." He activated his display and showed images of the reconstruction already beginning. Humans building shelters from the rubble of destroyed buildings. Humans planting crops in soil that was still warm from nuclear fire. Humans caring for the survivors of possession and helping them remember how to be human again. "I have one recommendation for this council," Prelax said, "and I urge you all to take it very seriously." He looked around at the 47 species representatives watching him. Under no circumstances should any species ever attempt to conquer Earth again. The humans have made something very clear through their actions. They would rather destroy their own world than let it belong to anyone else. And they would rebuild it afterward out of pure spite. The motion to officially classify Earth as unconquerable passed unanimously. 50 years later, the scars on Earth had mostly healed. The cities had been rebuilt in new designs that honored the old while looking toward the future. The oceans were blue again, and the sky was clear, and the sun shone warm on human faces. A memorial stood in the Pacific Ocean, marking the place where the door had been sealed. It was a simple monument, just a pillar of black stone rising from the waves with words carved into its surface. The inscription read, "They came for our home, they met its owners every year." On the anniversary of the battle, humans gathered at that memorial to remember what they had lost and what they had saved. The Admiral Chun did not live to see the 50th anniversary. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 92, surrounded by his granddaughter and her children. But his words lived on in human memory and in the records of the Galactic Council, and across the galaxy in 1,000 different languages, a new saying emerged whenever anyone discussed those strange, fierce, impossible creatures called humans. Pray they remain your allies, because nothing in the universe fights harder than a human defending their home. Not even common sense. The entity trapped between dimensions still screamed in its prison and would scream forever, but no one could hear it anymore. And on the world it had tried to consume, the children of humanity played in the sunlight and laughed and grew strong. They would face other threats in the centuries to come. Other enemies would rise, and other battles would be fought, but the humans would meet each challenge the same way they always had, with stubborn determination and impossible courage, and a simple refusal to ever give up, because Earth was their home, and nothing in the galaxy would ever take it from them again. This was the lesson the universe learned on terrible day when humanity attacked their own world. Humans were not sane by any reasonable definition, but they were free, and they would stay that way no matter what the cost. The stars themselves would burn out before humanity surrendered what was theirs, and that was a promise written in fire and blood and the ashes of 4 billion souls, a promise that would never be broken for as long as even one human heart continued to beat.